Welcome to CELT-cast, the bi-weekly podcast from the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching at Concordia University, Wisconsin in Ann Arbor. Your hosts, Rob Balza, Kate Robertson, and Carrie Bierke, bring you conversations with professors and thought leaders from around the world, sharing fresh insights on teaching and learning. This academic year, 2025 to 26, we're focusing on one of the most transformative forces in education today, artificial intelligence. Whether you're a faculty member, educational leader, or simply passionate about learning, CELT-cast is your space to explore ideas, spark curiosity, and imagine the future of education together.
All right, welcome to the next edition of CELT-cast. I'm your host, Rob Balza, and with me is Kate Robertson, also of CELT. Good morning, Kate.
Hey, Rob.
And today we're excited to have a special guest from Boston College, Professor of English, Carlo Rotella. Carlo holds a PhD from Yale University. He's a prolific writer. In fact, he has a brand new book entitled, "What Can We Get Out of This? Teaching and Learning in a Classroom Full of Skeptics." I'm sure you've all had plenty of skeptics in our classrooms over the years, so excited to dig into that book, Carlo. But what caught our attention is Kate and I have been focusing on artificial intelligence and thinking a lot about that lately. And we saw an interview that you did on WGPH and about how you're leaning into in-person discussion and what some would consider to be old-fashioned books and chalkboards in your classroom. Is it true you're actually asking students to read old-fashioned books written on paper, Carlo?
Yes, it is. And I always have to fight with the bookstore and tell them, listen, don't order ebooks. Students will be throwing their money away because they need a hard copy, need to have one in class. I really urge students to read with pen in hand, hard copy. I've started collecting, occasionally collecting scans of their markup. So they'll scan like a short story or 10 pages of a longer book that they're working on and turn in the markup as one of their weekly exercises. So yeah, and also, you know, don't try to play Monster Hunter at the same time as you're reading the book, and try to be somewhere quiet, and, you know, the whole sort of pushing back against the grain of this idea of the set of things that have been sold to us as convenience, that you should always be doing three things at the same time, that
Yes.
you know, things like that. And it's just like, well, there is actually a procedure for getting the most out of a book that's been around for a few hundred years.
Yeah, it's funny because since AI has kind of hit our campus here at Concordia University in Wisconsin, you know, we've had faculty that have really leaned into it, you know, and are embedding AI in every activity and class that they can, you know, every way they can possibly imagine. Now, other faculty who are zigging while other people are zagging, right? So bringing back, you know, blue books and, you know, doubling down discussion, oral exams and things like that. And so to kind of set the stage, Carlo, if it's all right, you know, I'm curious about your early experiences with AI. Like, what was your first impression when you first tried AI? Like, what are you using it for then? And maybe are you using it in any phase of your writing process now?
No, so I guess I will say I actively want my students to encounter teachers who teach them how to use AI. And I want them to be in classes where it's part of the class. And I also want them to take classes where they do all their own work. And I can teach that second kind of class, and I can't teach that first kind of class. I don't use it for anything. I subscribe to the sort of gymnasium theory. I guess going back to the original Greek gymnasium, which was a place for not only physical but intellectual development, which is that do your own work and you get stronger and faster and better. So anything you outsource is something you're not doing. And at least in the kind of work I do, which is, you know, reading and writing and talking to people and thinking, there's none of that I want to outsource. You know, when people say, well, I use it to brainstorm, it's, you know, what I use to brainstorm is walking around the city, right? That's what I use to brainstorm. And so I really don't want to share that process with a robot servant / overlord. I would rather do it myself. And especially, and I'm in 53rd grade, when we're talking about students, especially between the ages of 18 and 22, I want them doing their own work. So I really urge students to turn off spell check, turn off grammar check, do it all, and that's how you get the most out of the process of being in the class. The purpose of English classes is not to generate okay papers, right? It's to think. So I want them to do their own thinking, at least in my class.
Our chief academic officer, Leah Dvorak, is very fond of saying, writing is a way of training you to think. Writing is thinking. And yeah, outsourcing that writing process, you're outsourcing your thinking process in a lot of ways. And what I've been thinking about is my fear is that since AI has a way of kind of averaging everything out there on the internet, the more reliant we become on AI, the less original our products become, and a kind of regression to the mean sort of problem there. Although I've heard some futurists say that we may get to the point where AI is coming with original thoughts and things like that. I'm not sure what I think about that, or even if I want that. It's interesting to ponder that future, however.
But I think, right. So essentially at this point, it's just autocomplete, right? And so just imagine letting autocomplete do all the work, and that's not something I'm really interested in. But also, whether or not it can achieve that has nothing to do with your own ability to do that, right? So I mean, for hundreds of years, we've had machines that can move faster than people and lift more weight than people. And yet, if you want to get faster and you want to get stronger, you need to move the weight and you need to do the running. So the idea, it's like, well, a computer can play chess really well, but if I love chess, that's not why I'm interested in chess. I'm not interested in chess because I want great games of chess to have been played. I'm interested in chess because I want to do it and I want to get good at it. So the fact that, it's sort of a parlor trick at this point. Yeah, it can write, I mean, at least in our discipline in English, it can do mediocre work incredibly fast. I'm not that thrilled by that. That doesn't seem that interesting to me, but it's not about quality, and it's also not about cheating. I don't ban AI in my classes. I make sure I have enough assessments that are not AI-able. A blue book midterm and a final. I make class participation a really important part of the class. So in my classes, in order to qualify for any grade at all, you need to be a regular participant in class. That means we need to hear from you every time we meet. So if I do enough of that, then I am happy to assign papers and to say, I really recommend you don't use AI. And I teach process, so I have several phases that I see the paper in and an interview afterwards. So I have ways to keep an eye on the process, but it's not cheating if you use it. I think it's a waste of your money, a waste of your time, and a waste of my time, which is the real crime. So one thing I'd ask students is I say, listen, at the end of every paper, just write me a quick note just detailing whatever non-human help you got. And the purpose of that note is so I know how much effort to put into your paper, right? So if they didn't get any help, I line edit the whole paper. If they used Grammarly, then I'm just going to put a grade on it and talk about the ideas, right? If they use ChatGPT, I'm just going to put a grade on it, right? Because I'm not going to spend my time making ChatGPT's work better. That's a waste of everybody's time.
That's such a great point. I like that a lot. What do you think, Carlo, contributed to your decision to teach the way you do, discussion based, kind of unplugged, if you will? Is it, a reflection of who you are as a scholar? Is it kind of that notion of this is what my students need, this is kind of what they're paying for when they pay tuition, maybe a little bit of everything? Just kind of tell us about that.
Yeah, well, this is much predates AI. I mean, I would say that for the last 20, 25 years, I've been moving further in this direction. AI might have given me one more shove, but really it's that more and more, if you look at sort of the climate that students live in, they can get talked at by talking heads, pretty much 24/7 online. What they can't do is be in a room with a bunch of other people who've all read the same thing, trying to get meaning out of it, are undistracted by devices. So I have a no devices policy in my classroom. The two policies that matter are everybody talks and no devices, right? And I think that's what they're paying for in humanities course. I think they're paying for the admissions policy and they're paying for the hiring and promotion policy that produce the other people in the room. And I think that's it. So I've been moving more and more in that direction. And, if when I started teaching back in what my daughters called the 1900s, when I started teaching, I thought about it as delivering content or knowledge. I really think of it differently now. I think of it as I figure out who's in the room. I figure out what they would like to be able to do. Maybe I give them a couple other things to aspire to being able to do, but basically we start there. And so, the arrival of AI comes late in this process, and it just sort of pushes me further in that direction. And, I teach at Boston College. It's expensive. I mean, I figured it out. Students are paying $5 a minute for
Wow.
classes, right? If you think of it that way. So
Sure.
it's like, why would you spend $5 a minute to practice being replaceable by AI, right? I really focus. I do very little lecturing because I think that's something people can get elsewhere than my classroom. Now, granted, the lectures online are all pretty terrible, but I suppose in time they will get better. But what they can't get is this group of people, and I think really never again in their lives will they have a group of people who are paying attention to each other and this thing they have read. Certainly not in any meeting any of us has ever gone to. People are always distracted by their devices in meetings, not even in church, because have people always done the reading in church? Not always, right? So I really think this is kind of it. And this is the main event. So I've increasingly moved towards saying the 2,000 minutes we spend together in a semester is the main event. And the structure of the class is built around that. The participation policy, both the midterm and the final, are really focused on not only the reading, but on what we did with the reading in class. So I'm trying to design a course that says this is the main event. And in doing that, I'm going against the inclination all of us have and all of our students have, which is the main event is the deliverables. It's the papers, it's the whatever, and then the class is extra. And saying, no, actually class is the main event and everything else is extra.
Right.
Carlo, I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, and I can remember probably in high school, Nirvana doing Unplugged concerts and Eric Clapton doing Unplugged concerts. And I can remember just putting that CD on. I think this is the CD age. I didn't adopt records till actually later in life, but just not being able to turn that off and so entranced by the purity of the sound and things like this. And I think similarly, I mean, there is a hunger for students to live unplugged in some ways, and including in that classroom environment. And I'm curious if that's a response that the way your students have reacted to your course, or do you find some of them feel like this is too old-fashioned and they're not getting the cutting edge stuff that they need?
Yeah. So my general impression is relief, for the most part, is that, okay, so for 75 minutes, this is the class where I get to be a human being and where I am not only free to speak, but expected to speak, and I think of that as citizenship, right? That, other people might call it social and emotional learning, or they have other categories for it. I think of that as citizenship, right? And these are craft skills you're going to need. So I would push back on the cutting edge part. I think that the ability to be a value adding participant in a discussion class is essential practice for being a citizen, but also for being a worker. I mean, students in college are their aspiration is to be post-industrial workers, right? Nobody goes to college so they can work in a factory, right? For the most part. And so, or at least not on the line of a factory, right? So, understanding how, if you don't add value, you're fired, right? But you can't dominate. You can't dominate to the point that you're preventing other people from adding value. So I think that's essential. Those are essential life skills. That's equipment for living. And you actually don't get to practice that very much anymore because of phones and now AI. That, among other things, it decreases the chances a student will come to office hours, right? Because they can ask a bot and it will give them an autocomplete answer, but it will give them some kind of answer without awkwardness and instantaneously. So my experience in classes has been students will say at first, oh, this is going to be kind of awkward. And, there's a great horror of awkwardness in the cell phone age. But that we just go through that and out the other side. And part of participating is that when you participate, when you become a citizen, that what you do in class stops feeling like public speaking. And it starts feeling more like being in a band or on a team, right? Which is, we convene twice a week, everybody works on their individual chops, and we also as a community work on our collective ability to define problems and solve them. Most people find that pretty satisfying, even if it makes them anxious, and in working on this book, I interviewed students a lot, and it does make them anxious that they have to talk. And I just, I try to lower the bar as much as possible so that, give people as many ways as possible to participate. If they're having trouble talking, I have them come into my office. We think about why it's hard. We try and find solutions. If necessary, we rehearse, class participation. We think about, okay, maybe this is going to be the first question I ask at our next class meeting. Why don't you write out an answer, put your hand up, and I'll just call on you first. And we'll just rip the Band-Aid off, right? So there are things you can do to get people involved, and then getting involved tends to lead to more comfort. So my experience is, yes, there's initial awkwardness and there's initial pause. I wouldn't say resistance exactly, but I think people get used to it. And the other thing is, it's a private university. If you don't want to take my class, just take somebody else's class, right? Don't.
Sure.
At a certain point, I can just, if I was a public high school teacher, I couldn't do that. But I'm teaching at Boston College, and I can just say, listen, if this isn't for you, this isn't for you. Like, I promise you that if you really, really refuse to speak in this class, this class is going to be torture for you, and it's going to be torture for us. So just don't do it, right? And that's fine. It doesn't hurt my feelings. I think, the way I do it is not for everybody.
Carlo, I've been teaching for 20 plus years, mostly like biochemistry type courses. And I've tried to incorporate discussion into every single one of them. But I've never, I'm ashamed to admit, coached a student on how to be more effective participator in my classes. And I'm really inspired by what you just shared. I mean, you're really building those soft skills in those students that are going to translate to the boardroom and things like that, and are desperately needed again in the cell phone age.
I mean, I have this, there's this chapter in the book called Speaking Up, where I just take 2 case studies of 2 students who had difficulty talking. And one of the points I make in that chapter is that for us, all of us as teachers, when students don't talk, or when we have like a dead class, we always just get mad. It's just kids today, they don't read and they don't think. But actually, the opacity of this of silence covers up enormous differences between the students. And as you go student by student, the reason for each student's silence is very different, and it can usually be attacked with some really pretty basic stuff right out of the behavioral psychology textbook, right? Lower the bar to participation, positively reinforce it when it happens, and if it's really bad, rehearse it. And I've had a couple students who just were so panicked by it that they just came into office hours. I asked a question. They raised their hand in my office. I called on them. They gave an answer. I said, that's a good answer. Let's do it again. I asked the question again. They raised their hand. We did that like 5 times, which is exactly what you would do if you were in a band or on a team. We're just not getting that play right? So let's just run the play, right? And just let's get it ingrained in muscle memory. So far, I will say, I have never had a student I had these conversations with who didn't begin participating. I've never had a student who went through all that and said, I'm still not doing it. I think now it may be that those students would have just dropped the class a long time ago, and that's fine. I'm not, this is not a panacea. This is not for every single student. I will say that most students who are silent have something to say and are just having trouble saying it.
Oh, 1000%. Yeah. I love that. Thanks for sharing all of that. So I guess in addition to kind of that advice as far as like office hours and kind of going through that rehearsal, if you will, what would be some other advice you might have for faculty who want to kind of move more in this direction with their teaching?
Well, I do think that, like paper assignments, conversation has to feel authentic. So, it can't be that you're hiding the answer behind your back and the class is trying to guess it, right? So it has to be. So one of the things I do a lot, I teach literature, is we just start with a noticing exercise, so people can just notice word choice, imagery, anything about the form, without having a whole interpretation of it or anything like that. So we usually start with a noticing exercise. The bar is nice and low. And then, we're essentially making a pile of things we've noticed. And then we start looking for patterns in the pile. And part of the reason to do it that way is I'm not saying, can anyone guess what I think this novel is really about, right? But rather, and it's going to be different every time that I teach the same text, because each class is going to do something different with it, right? So it has to feel authentic. It has to feel like we are building something. We are modeling the process of noticing details, pattern recognition, and then coming up with the logic, the meaning that organizes them. I think that's a big one. And then the other thing is varieties of participation. You know, some people like to ask questions, some people like to answer questions, some people like to go first, some people like to wait and go last, right? So as they say in the boxing world, where I spend a fair amount of time because I write about boxing, among other things, styles make fights, right? So that's also true of discussions. So I try to think a little bit about how can I mix up the kinds of prompts, the kinds of questions, the kinds of activities we're doing so that different styles can find their way. So one thing I've learned to do much too late, I should have thought of this many years ago, is I'll just in the course of asking questions and doing what I do in class, I'll stop and say, hey, wait, on this one, let's not raise hands right away. Everybody, just take out a piece of paper and write yourself a couple notes about this, just 30 seconds. And what that does is it reminds me, among other things, to stop calling on the glibest, most articulate, quickest people and get people who like to chew on things a little bit involved. Sure. So some of it is just technique and a lot of it is on me, like really little things. Like I've learned to make more if-then statements in class. A bunch of students say stuff, then I say, well, if what so-and-so said is true and what so-and-so said is true and what so-and-so said is true, then it seems like chapter 5 is a problem because it would seem to say the opposite. Like statements that gather up what people have said and then generate the next problem from it, which again is sort of reinforcing the idea that what we're doing here is making something together, not me dispensing an interpretation of the word.
I love that. Something that I do with my classes, I like so much of what you do as well, but something that's worked for me, I teach primarily freshmen. They barely know where the health center is yet, you know what I mean? So they're really just finding their way and, getting along with roommates and all those types of things. And, they're 18, 19 years old. We were all there. So I've found that I'm fortunate enough to teach in a room that has circle tables. So there's 3 or 4 people at every table. So I do a lot of hash this out at your table for a few minutes, and then I'm going to ask for each table to share something. And there is so much less fear and panic in being able to say, we talked about it and we said this, that, versus I'm putting myself out there and I thought this, but maybe I'm totally wrong. And so, I want them to get to the point where they're more comfortable saying that, but at least, kind of in the beginning, I really like that, turn and talk and kind of everybody share too. So that reminds me of kind of what you were talking about.
It is, and I will freely admit I am not much of a small group work virtuoso. I could be much better at that because exactly for the reasons that you described, that it's a way to get everybody involved and it's a way to be responsible to first a small group and then the larger group, especially if you give the small groups a clear task. Think about the introduction, find 3 things in there that are puzzling or that, lead to things later in the text, and then be prepared to report to the class. Something like that gives people a clear task. I'm not so good at it. And one of the ways I rationalize that to myself, and I'm probably just rationalizing it, is that a group of people having a conversation for 75 minutes requires a kind of stamina that the rest of the culture is trying to eliminate. So that I'm basically teaching straight pool to a bunch of 9-ball players, and 9-ball, the reason everybody loves 9-ball is you just big break, you sink a couple shots, pay off bets. A straight pool game can take hours with players just playing safe over and over and over. And so part of what I'm doing is sort of teaching intellectual stamina. One thing I tell my students is at the beginning of the semester is if you are tempted to get up and quote unquote go to the bathroom so you can look at your phone, that makes you a coward, right? So don't do that, right? Because that's why people go to the bathroom, right? Is so they can look at their phones. So part of what I'm teaching, I think, is things like doing your own work and a certain kind of stamina. And so it's hard for people who don't normally sit with a group of people for 75 minutes to sit with a group of people and talk. That said, I should have better small group chops than I do.
Carlo, I just got back from the Conference of Independent Colleges in Indianapolis. It was a meeting of a lot of higher ed leaders from independent colleges all across the country and quite a few outside of the country as well. And everyone was talking about AI. And everyone's trying to figure out, like, where is this whole thing going, and how do we integrate into the curriculum? Do we, start our own majors and graduate programs in AI? Um, but one thing that I heard quite a bit, especially from liberal arts colleges, is a prediction that a lot of our programs, especially programs in the humanities, programs like yours, like English,
Mhm.
that have kind of taken a beating in the past few years, right? So, enrollment's declining, those kinds of things. I heard some really smart, thoughtful people saying there's going to be a comeback. The humanities are coming back. People are going to remember, what we loved about the humanities and see its value more and more in the face of this AI. And I know you don't have a crystal ball, but um, do you take an optimistic view of the future like that, or your view of how this impacts higher education more pessimistic?
Sure. I mean, I've heard that too. So I write for the New York Times Magazine, and I'm just finishing a piece that's going to come out later in November on teaching English in the age of AI. So I've been talking to people around the country, and I'm hearing that too, that humanists who I think have been unforgivably um, weak about standing up for their disciplines, have sort of gone into the fetal position for 20 years, have started to say, oh, well, okay, in our classes, you get to be a human being, and we're also teaching this really basic stuff that people need to know how to do, um, and maybe need to know how to do more and now than they used to. So, for instance, what you do when you read, at the level of letter to letter and word to word, but also thematically through the whole text, what you do, among other things, is you're gauging the reliability of everything you're seeing. You're making predictions. You're going back to see that what you're reading makes sense. You're doing all this work when you're reading, right? And if you don't
Yes.
do it, you lose the ability to do things like discern an underlying theme or decide how reliable this is, or be able to encompass the perspectives of other people. Now, these are exactly the things we're getting an F in as a culture, right? Those, like, that would be it. Understanding the reliability of what you read, be able to understand other people's perspectives. This is what we're unbelievably bad at. And I think humanists are sort of realizing that, especially if we're going to live in a world full of AI generated content, you're going to need some sort of independent critical faculty for understanding this stuff and judging it. And like, I saw a video online of George Soros clinking champagne flutes with Satan. I think that is not real.
Yeah.
That there's a certain amount of just understanding that, doing your own reading, doing your own writing, as you said, reading is thinking, writing is thinking, right? And I think humanists are starting to realize, okay, in our classes is where you get to be a human being, where you're working on these basic skills. What you teach in English is the work of extracting meaning from the world around you. That's not going to be going out of style anytime soon, right? And that's also, I'm not going to settle for ChatGPT's understanding of meaning in the world around me. I'm not going to ask ChatGPT what it thinks the State of the Union address meant, right? I want to understand what I think it meant. I want to understand what my neighbor thinks it meant. So yeah, I do see humanists starting to realize that maybe instead of sort of constantly apologizing because they're not high tech enough, they might be in a position to give people equipment for living that they need, which has always been true, right? But they sort of haven't really been thinking about it that way. So yeah, I've been seeing some of that too, and I've also I think the other thing that happened was in the spring and in the summer, there were a couple of really well-circulated magazine stories about how everybody's cheating using AI and how it's the end of the essay and all that. And I think what happened is people thought really hard about their teaching over the summer. And the
Yes.
result of that, and also a lot of people finally got around to banning devices from their classes this fall. As a result, I'm interviewing people and they're saying, I don't understand it. My students are so engaged. My classes are going so well. It's like, well, you thought about your teaching. You revamped your courses and upgraded your thinking about assignments and what you're going to do in class, and you banned devices from your class. And guess what? Your students are more engaged.
Dr. Carlo Rotella, that's a perfect place to stop. Thank you so much for your time. In the show notes, we'll link to your website, your new book, and the news story about how you're going old school in the classroom.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to CELT-cast, brought to you by the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching at Concordia University, Wisconsin in Ann Arbor. We hope today's conversation gave you something valuable to take away. whether a new idea to apply in your teaching practice or simply a perspective to consider further. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Production for this episode was done by Ashley Curtin. Until next time, thank you for joining us and keep teaching faithfully.